Hello YouTube, welcome to Mr. Natural's Music School here in San Francisco, California. Welcome. So we've been working on the staff. The first week we talked about a brief history of music and the development of writing and then the development of the staff. Last week we talked about the staff as what we call the ABC fixed system, and we haven't talked about anything fixed yet. And probably won't get to it till the end of this lecture tonight, and you'll see what I mean by a fixed system. And taking everything that we did last week, we now know that it started out with one or two lines, and the first two things that we had were these things called clefs. It was assumed with the two-line system that the bottom line was always C. And then later people said, well, wait, from here up, good, great for sopranos, but what about bass? And so for bass, they wanted to say, oh, let's look at this line and then write going in this direction. So what happened is they developed the first clef, which was basically that, the letter C. And they just simply put it there and said, okay, C is here. Then what happened is, later they go, okay, that's good for treble. For bass, we'll put the C here. So now the C is here, and we know that this is C, and then we can write below C. Now C is still referred to as a fixed pitch. Usually it was middle C, which is about 256 cycles per second. So 256 hertz, as they would call it, is C, middle C. Then what happened is the first clef was truly developed, in which they took the letter B from type cases and they took the italicized version of B, slanted B, small b, and made this thing which today we call a flat, but they didn't call it a flat back then. It was actually, it wasn't an accidental as we refer to it today, it was actually a clef. And what would happen is if they put this clef on this bottom line, that represented the letter name F. And again, if we wanted to write things for sopranos, we'd say F and we would write up like this, add ledger lines as we need them. And since back then people could sing 5 good notes, and some real professionals could sing 10 good notes, there wasn't any need to do more than this. And then what happened is they wanted to write stuff for bass. So what they did is they went, okay, there is now F. That's our letter name F right there. And now we'll put our ledger lines below, and we can extend 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 notes in this direction, and easily write a 5-note pattern down here, pentatonic down there. And you'll notice that the clef has moved up in order to write for bass, and moves down in order to write for treble, because you're writing above the clef. All right? So now, then we talked about what happened was they started adding more and more and more and more and more lines, until finally we wound up with a staff system that basically was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 lines and 15 spaces. And here's, we say, oh, well, there's F right there, and they could write for the treble, and they could write bass lines down here. And what happened is, as the notes moved across the staff, it got impossible to keep this reference line. I even saw in one case a person did this, where they actually took and wrote a thicker line down the center for the do line. They called it the do line, so you had a reference, and then you could measure everything from here down or from there up, because this became our 1. We don't have a 0 in music. 0 in music is a rest or no sound. So if you're producing a sound at all, that was 1, or do. And this do system, you could write things up here for sopranos, or you could write things down here for basses. And what happened is, as people read music, they got lost in this. So they started reducing the staff, and besides reducing the staff, instead of going to a thicker line, someone came up with this idea of, well, why don't we just get rid of these, and for our grand staff, have 5 lines here, and 5 lines up here. And so we wound up with what looks like the staff, the grand staff system that we have now. And these were connected like that, boom, boom, to show that these 2 individual staffs, which could each be written for a single instrument, and they had as many staffs as they had instruments, and that was orchestra music. And each person took a 5-line, 6-space staff, which allowed them to write 11 notes. And then on here they could write 11 notes, etc., etc. I remember looking at a YouTube once in which Quincy Jones was being interviewed, and he was talking about when he was learning music, his music teacher said to him, well, Quincy, there's only 11 notes, it shouldn't be that hard, right? And I wondered, we know that there are 12 chromatic tones, or 7-note scales. I couldn't figure out where that came from until one day I realized that he knew what I knew that nobody talks about. They always say 5 lines and 4 spaces, but it's actually 5 lines and 6 spaces, so 5 plus 6 was 11. And I finally figured out what Quincy Jones was talking about. What his teacher was talking about is on the staff, starting here, you can notate 11 notes across the staff, and that was where that statement came from. Some of you might run into that on YouTube one of these days, or look at that interview, and if you wonder what he meant by 11 notes and you're scratching your head, that's what he meant. So he knew that there were 6 spaces. You know there's 6 spaces. Everybody knows there's 6 spaces, but in the music books they still say 5 lines, 4 spaces. The next thing that happened is clefs began to develop. We had the C clef and we had the F clef. And what happened is, as new instruments were being developed, each instrument got a clef and a staff that they could write on. And most instruments, almost all the woodwind instruments, have a bandwidth of about 2.5 octaves. From the lowest note they can play to the highest, about 2.5 octaves. Even on the violin, you have basically 2 octaves in first position, and then if you go up the violin, you can add a 3rd octave. And the same on guitar. Across those 6 strings, we have 2 octaves. Go up to the 12th fret, you've got 3 octaves. So those instruments were the instruments that had the biggest bandwidth. Clarinet has almost 3 octaves. Flute has 2.5, saxophone 2.5, good octaves on them. You had to be a virtuoso to hit those really, really, really high notes or the really, really low notes. And so the staff with 5 lines and 6 spaces and some kind of a clef was enough to write what you needed to write. But what the clefs were is, the clefs were developed, don't forget, in around between 1400 and 1600. And in that period of time, they didn't do the alphabet like we do, like this, Helvetica. Helvetica is rather modern, and we didn't write letters like that. The letter A, for instance, would have some nice flowery stuff like this, and probably have a little curve up there, and then they would bring this part down and do a little thing like that, and they would probably do a little zigzag like that, and this would be an A. Fancy, fancy, fancy. And if you look at Old English, or what's called Gothic lettering, what you're going to see is this fancy stuff with little scrolls, little flowers, little flower buds, little leaves hanging off of it, everything from dandruff to God knows what. And these things here on the end were, the Romans referred to them as serifs. And what happened is, as time went on and we simplified things, we got rid of all the serifs until we approached this beautiful German lettering called Helvetica, which is probably now the most used lettering in advertising. It's clean, it's clear, it's easy to see, and all the letters in the alphabet have about almost the same spacing, and same clarity, so you have an entire alphabet that's well balanced. And this is the whole world of fonts. You got to talk to people who design and make fonts for a living, and they'll explain this to you. So what happened was we had a plethora of letters of the alphabet. Since we started using the in 935 BC, Otto Chladni went from the do re mi, or the old solfege systems, which a lot of people use, to the ABC systems. We had A, B, C up to G, and then the system resets and goes over again, A, B, C. So what we have is only 7 letter names that we are using at the present to notate music on the staff. And so what happened is one of these 7 letters in Old English Gothic would be the clef. Now, what happens is when clefs were developed, and let me start with the bass clef. When the bass clef was first developed, it actually started out like this, a little circle like that, and this little circle here replaced the little flat, and it became the letter name F. And if you wanted to write stuff for sopranos, you would put the F down here at the bottom, so you could write above it and have things for sopranos. But if you wanted to write for altos, for instance, then what they would do is they would put that clef right there. And again, what you have here basically is bullseye marks the spot, right? Boop, boop. It's creating a bullseye. And then what happened, so F got moved to this line. Then when you have your tenors, you would do this. So you had your tenors and your baritones, and then F went up to this line, like that. And then later, when you wanted to write for bass, it went like that. So F moved up to this line. And then when you wanted to write for sub bass, right, it would do that. And sub bass was used quite often for organs. Organs have these extra pedals that people use their feet with to play that go even lower than some have these really long 16-foot pipes, 32-foot pipes, which go lower than the piano. And so what happened is you would take this clef, which represented the letter F, and you would move it on different places in the staff. It would be low down on the staff if you wanted to do soprano stuff, so you would be able to have, could put it all here, could fit what they're singing, the bandwidth on the staff. And for the altos, you'd move it up because they would be a little bit below and a lot above. And then for the baritones, of course, you'd put it here. For the basses, you'd put it up there, and for sub bass, way up here. So the clef would go up higher and higher and higher on the staff as you're notating things lower and lower and lower. And it would be lower on the staff as you're notating things that are going higher and higher and higher. All that sort of made sense. And what happened is, after a while, this thing got turned around, and it started going, just got shortened to that. And then they did this, put 2 little dots on either side, so you knew that the line that was going through this thing also went through these 2 dots. So use these 2 dots and that dot as a way to align this on the line, and we knew that that line was the letter name F. So if you look in Wikipedia, for instance, they'll show you the old-fashioned version, and then they'll show you the newer shorthand version of it and how it developed and how it got turned around. And then you'll also see that this, what we now call a bass clef, was actually used to write every one of the 5 different voice parts. It depended on where it was. When it was down here, it was doing soprano and, super sopranos. And when you had it down here, it was doing bass and sub bass. The other thing is this letter C got really fancy, and there were C's that were kind of like, had flowers going off in every kind of direction. And the problem was, it used to pinch in, these little dots here would pinch in and show you where the line was at, but that became unclear, and the next development for the C clef was people did this, and what happened is they went, oh, right there, and people went, well, that looks like an E, so the problem was, to differentiate that, they did this, they put those little dots there on either side to help it line on that land, and then later on, some people took this, what we call the cent mark or the $ mark, and put those through, and it started doing this, but it still looked like the letter E, so people wouldn't see that as a C clef. So again, that got flipped or turned around until it became this, which today we refer to as the transposition C clef, or is also known as the viola clef. The violas are the only instrument in the orchestra which have preserved this clef, and they like to put it, this thing going right down the center here, they like to put it right here, since we have 5 lines, they like to put it right there on that center line. So the viola clef, or what was also used for alto, right here in this area, is alto. Down here, it would be soprano. Up here, it would be bass, right? But right here in the middle, it was alto, and so it became the alto clef. And since the viola has a string, instead of the lowest string being G, the lowest string is a C below that, it's 5 letter names lower, they used this as their clef. So it became the viola clef. Now, it looks like a 3 with lines through it, but it is still represented by the letter name C. What happened also is another clef that had been bouncing around was one in which we wanted to take the letter G and put that on the staff, and what people did is they fancied it up with a little thing here, got rid of that and put the bullseye, and right here again we're crossing this line to tell us which letter name is the letter name G, and some people speculate that this little curly Q down here represents the letter C. It's a myth. I don't know if it's true or not, but it certainly has been batted around a lot. But if you look at the history, that doesn't make any sense, because that clef was also movable. And all of the clefs were movable, but they could only be moved to a line. And that's significant. So again, if we took and put the treble clef as we see it today, right there, then that spot, that line became the letter name G. And you'll notice that, again, if you look at Wikipedia, you'll see there's one more that they represent, and it is right down here. And instead of calling this a treble clef, again, this is where the treble, remember right here, these lines here, you got your treble to your soprano, you have your altos, right, altos, and your tenors, and then your basses come in this part of the thing. So this also became the treble clef, but it should properly refer to as the G clef. What happened is, when it was down here, it was for violin music. And in French music, they still refer to this particular clef as the French violin clef. But it's still telling us that this line now is a letter name G. And again, this clef was movable and could be moved around in 5 positions. My pens are dying. Last week I looked at the green, and you can't read a thing that I wrote last week, so hopefully you got to listen carefully to what I'm saying, and if you have a pencil and paper, you should write out what I was drawing on the board, because you can't really see it. Going back to black, but these black pens, gravity pulls it away. They don't write very dark. So what happened is, again, we would have the extreme soprano would make this the letter G. If we wanted treble, this would become the letter G. If we wanted to go from the altos down to the tenors, We'd have that if we wanted to do the baritone, and if we wanted to do the bass. And this G clef could be used as a bass clef quite easily, just by putting it up here. So again, the higher it is on the staff, the lower it represents, because the entire idea of music writing back then was not mechanical, it was aesthetic. And the idea was to make the music notation easy for the musician to read, and therefore they would adjust the clef so the bandwidth of the instrument always went from this low space to this high space, and they had a bandwidth of 11 notes. And they would put this anywhere it is convenient. Now I'm talking about a fixed system, and you can see that this is not fixed. These clefs are movable. But they have one flaw, and the one flaw is they can only be put on the lines. They could not be put on the spaces. So if you're using the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do system, do could only be placed on a line. Do, 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 or do. You could not have do on a space. What happened is these clefs became less and less in favor until eventually we came up with the 3 clefs that we have left, and that is on the top we use the G or treble clef to show us where the letter name G is. 5 notes below that, where we have middle C, we would have the C clef, and then the staff underneath that, 5 notes below that, would be the F clef. So here we have C up 5 notes, G down 5 notes, F, and whether it's up or down will become very significant as I explain later. What happened is we moved from the clef system, and these clefs became fixed, and especially in piano music, where they put these together and create what's called a grand staff. And this system became, these staffs stopped moving around and became fixed. And this is where the fixed system comes from. So now what happens is you have a direct correlation between where these things are at and what they would be on the piano. So here's the piano, and here is our middle C. When you're sitting at the piano, your belly button points at C, and you have about 3.5 octaves on this side, and you got about 3.5, 4 octaves on that side. For either arm, stretch out. You can stretch 6 to 7. The piano is 7.5 octaves wide, so middle C is right where the belly button is at. So here is middle C. And this is this invisible line, and we talked about the invisible line is invisible because why? Because there was a space here and a space here, which nobody seems to talk about or want to talk about. And what happened is you can't have space, space, line, space, line, space, when you're going line, space, line, space, line, space, line, space, 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 line, space, line, space. So it became assumed that there was an invisible line that went between these 2 staffs called C. So the invisible C is really there because of the line, space, line, space, line, space thing. This C became middle C, or fixed, at 256, roughly 256 cycles per second, and the tuning standard eventually became this A. The A above C, where if you're going from C up, the first A you bump into becomes 440 cycles per second. We call them hertz. And this is now the A tuning standard. And some people refer to it as A prime. They put a little on the side there. A. 440 cycles per second. And everything is electronically or mathematically calculated from that A in either direction. This C represents that there. So if we count up here to the G, you'll see right there is A, and that is 440 cycles per second. I prefer CPS, cycles per second. That became our standard, and that fixed the system. The clefs were no longer movable. They were in a fixed position, And there is a direct one-to-one relationship between this and that, this and that, this and on this side, that. And if you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 notes up, there's that clef. Here's your C clef, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 notes down, and there's your F. So you have the C clef here, the G clef or treble clef there, and you have down here the F clef. So this became fixed, and every note and every line on here became fixed to a place on any of these, this keyboard. So the keyboard and the staff now became one and the same. Now, the advantage to this system is, because there's a one-to-one match, it's easy to learn to read music and just learn by rote. Well, here's middle C. You see there's something there? Push that button. You see something there? Push that button. You see something over there? Use your left hand, push that button. Right hand, left hand. And that's pretty much the way it's taught. And then, of course, extending this into the orchestra when orchestration happened. But, again, the problem was these things were only on lines. And the number 1, or do, could not be moved to any of the spaces. A system was developed to teach people how to read these things, and that is a little mnemonic or poems were developed so that people could read, and the poems kind of went like this. And I mentioned these last week. And they are this. Here, for the lines on the treble clef, the first line is E, so this is every good boy deserves fudge, or every good boy does fine. Not find, but fine. So every good boy deserves fudge names these lines. And then the spaces here, F-A-C-E, define those spaces, and we have no poem for these guys on either side, which again gives this myth that there's 5 lines and 4 spaces instead of 6 spaces. For the bass clef, the bottom line became the letter G, and so they use this thing, good boyfriends don't forget anniversaries, in order to remember the lines on the bass clef, and all cows eat grass, in order to remember the 4 spaces. And again, this space and that space, no poem. So what happens is you've got these 4 things that you have to memorize in order to know the fixed names and positions of these of the lines and spaces on the staff. And what happens is it is too much, just too much to remember. Now, most people who play single or solo instruments like saxophones, flutes, oboe, etc., they only work with the treble clef. So they only have 2 poems to remember, and that's not too bad. And if you work with something like trombone, baritone, tuba, or bass guitar, stuff like that, or stand-up bass, you're using the bass clef, and again, you just have 2 poems to remember, not so bad. But if you're a pianist, or you're a good guitar player, you should be, and if you're a French horn player, you have to learn the treble clef, the bass clef, and the transposition C clef. For trombone, if you go by a trombone fingering chart, you will still see there are 3 pages of the fingering chart, and in one page they show the treble clef or the G clef. On another one they show the C transposition clef, and both of those clefs are offset because the instrument is in B flat, and what they show as C is actually concert D. And then what happens is on the bass line they show it in concert pitch. So trombone players who have learned to read the bass clef have learned to read their trombone in concert pitch. So B flat is actually B flat on the meter. F would be F on the meter. A would be A on the meter, etc. Now, what we've done here at the classroom is we've experimented with this, and I learned that if you extended those 2 more to get 6, if you arrange these things into into 7-letter groupings, there is one poem that you can use that works for everything, no matter what clef you're looking at. And that is cows eat grass, but don't fly airplanes. Cows eat grass, but don't fly airplanes. So again, if we have the staff here, and let's say I wrote this, we would go cows eat grass, but don't fly, and one ledger line above, airplanes. If I am writing for the bass clef, all we have to say is fly airplanes, cows eat grass, but don't fly airplanes. We just start with the letter name. If we're going to use the treble clef, put the treble clef here. Going to use the treble clef, then we go grass, but don't fly airplanes, cows eat grass. So you see, this one poem will work, and all you have to do is start on the letter name of the clef. Okay? Now, before I came up with that, I had what I thought was an even more brilliant idea for this, and we put it in our book. So here's the Mr. Natural Music Theory Decoded, which you can find at Amazon.com, putting in a plug. And in here originally we had, instead of this, we used all cars eat gas, but don't fart. I'm going to put that word, write that one out. All cars eat gas, but don't fart. And I liked that because it made sense. But what we discovered over the years is things that make sense are easily forgotten. And things that are nonsense are easier for people to remember. So all cows eat grass, but don't fly airplanes turned out because the bottom half, all cows eat grass, made sense, but don't fly airplanes, didn't make any sense, unless you're thinking of the grass as the kind you smoke rather than the kind you walk on. Then what happened is, because it didn't make sense, it was easier for people to remember. So all cows eat grass, but don't, all cars eat gas, but don't fart. And that works as well. Then one day it occurred to me that since in the treble clef here you had F, A, C, E, and as I talked to people over the years, that seemed to be the one thing that they could remember. If they forgot all the other little poems, this was the one thing they remembered, F, A, C, E. So I thought to myself, well, what's missing? Well, what's missing is this space, that space, and that space. And then I thought, well, how about this? Grizzly bears dirty face. Grizzly bear's dirty face. Grizzly bear's dirty face. And it turns out this is the easiest one to remember. So we've given you 3 that will work for all the clefs, and you can pick whichever one you like. Grizzly bear's dirty face is probably the easiest to remember. Now the thing about this is it's called the circle of thirds, and the circle of thirds are also the names for almost every chord that's written. So if I start here on C, E, G, you'll see C, E, G, C, E, grizzly. If I were to write a chord here, it would be F, A, C. And no matter where I write the chord, in especially 3-note chords, what's going to happen is it's going to be going around this thing as if it was a circle. So if you think of it as grizzly, bears, dirty, F, A, C, E, going this way, you're going up the chord, going in this direction, you're naming the chords backwards, and this, grizzly bear's dirty face, is the easiest way to remember this entire system. Now, I've mentioned that it's fixed, and that the problem we have at this point is that every one of these clefs only land on a line. So the question is, how did our forebears get do off of the line and into the spaces? And I will talk about that next week. The system that was developed was called accidentals because it would move you have 7 letters of the alphabet, and if you added the accidentals, you'd be moving outside of the this normal pattern, so they were accidental, or they were deviations. And we'll talk about that and how it developed. The sharps and the flats are the accidentals. The neutral line is also an accidental that gets rid of those other 2 accidentals, and we'll talk about how they evolved and how they're on the staff and how they are used to move do to a space. That was their primary reason for being. So, thank you again for coming. I know this seems like a lot, but please remember, we are talking about from the 10th, from 1000, from the 1000, the year 1000, now to the year 2018, we're talking about 1018 years worth of history. And to do it in the short period of time and cover everything that I can think of quickly, it's going to take time. So next week we will pick up with accidentals. And the accidentals will be sharps, flats came back, and then what's called the neutral sign. This is considered masculine. This is considered feminine, and this is considered hermaphroditic. And we'll explain that concept and why that happened. The sharps wound up always going to the keys above C, and the flats wound up being mapped in for the keys below C. And we'll show you why that is relevant and how it will help you memorize the order of the sharps and flats, okay? The idea that there are only 7 sharps or 7 flats that can be put on the staff is a misnomer. Remember, music theory, you can do things that are abstract. You can go beyond what's on the keyboard. You can go beyond what people are playing on a string. And what happens is it can go into outer space. So we have what are also known as double sharps and double flats. And there are triple sharps and triple flats, folks. So we'll explain all of that next week. Until then, see you. You all have a good time out there. Be careful out there. The world's a very dangerous place. Don't trip over anything. And we hope to see you all in good health next week. Night-night, everybody.